There's a man standing on the porch of the Hendersons' old place, and I don't think he belongs there. Someone needs to come out here right now." The voice on the other end of the line didn't ask many questions because it never had to with her, and that was the problem that nobody in Whitmore Heights had ever been willing to name out loud. Whitmore Heights sat about 12 miles outside the city in that particular kind of quiet, that only money can manufacture, the kind where even the sound of a lawn sprinkler felt choreographed, where every driveway edge was clean enough to suggest that disorder of any kind, moral, aesthetic, or otherwise, had simply agreed not to show up here. The houses were large colonial in their bones, with wide front porches and deep-set windows that let the morning light pour in generously. The oak trees lining Caldwell Street had been there longer than any of the current residents, and they dropped their leaves every autumn in slow, unhurried drifts, as if they too understood the pace expected of them. On a Saturday morning in late October, the loudest thing on Caldwell Street was the rhythm of a high-end irrigation system running on a timer, and the distant bark of a dog somewhere around the corner, and beneath all of that, if you listened closely enough, the sound of a woman standing behind a narrow slit in her Venetian blinds at 319 Caldwell, watching the house directly across the street with the kind of focused attention that had nothing generous in it. The moving trucks had come 2 days ago, and Mara Osei had seen them from her own front walk, had stood there with her coffee going cold in her hand, and watched the men carry boxes and furniture up the front steps of number 317, that 4-bedroom colonial that had sat empty for 3 months since the Hendersons relocated to Florida, and she had thought, the way any decent person might, that she ought to bring something over soon, a plate of food, or just a knock on the door and a hello, because that was what you did when someone new arrived on your street. Through the bare branches of the oak at the edge of the property line, Mara could see that a few of those moving boxes were still visible through the large front window of 317, stacked in the living room. Not yet unpacked the interior of the house, still in that in-between state of being occupied but not yet inhabited, not yet someone's home in the full sense of that word. She adjusted the leash in her hand as her dog, a brown and white beagle named Cosmo, tugged gently toward the sidewalk, and she let herself be pulled along. And as she moved past number 319, she glanced up at the window, almost without meaning to. And for just a fraction of a second, she caught the edge of a blind snapping back into place, and the impression of a face retreating from the glass, and she felt something she couldn't quite name settle in the back of her mind, like a note played in the wrong key. She kept walking. Cosmo found something interesting near the storm drain. The morning stayed quiet, but not for long. Dorothy Pell had lived at 319 Caldwell Street for 22 years, which was longer than most of the current residents had been in the neighborhood at all, and she had used those 22 years to build something she considered a kind of civic infrastructure, a network of attention and response that she genuinely believed kept Whitmore Heights what it was. She had served 2 terms as president of the Homeowners Association, had authored the revised noise ordinance that went into effect in 2019, and had a contact list on her phone that included not the general 911 dispatch line, but the direct desk number of the Saturday morning duty sergeant at the Whitmore Township Police Department, a number she had obtained during a neighborhood watch meeting 6 years ago, and had never once felt guilty about using. She had called that number 7 times in the past 3 years alone. Once because a catering van had parked with 2 tires over the property line of the Garcias' house on the night of their daughter's quinceañera. Once because a group of teenagers she didn't recognize were playing basketball in the cul-de-sac at the far end of Caldwell at 9:30 on a summer evening, and even though she could not hear them from her house, she knew they were there. Once because a plumber, a heavy-set black man with a company logo on his shirt and a work order visible on his clipboard, had been working inside the open garage of a neighbor's house on a Tuesday afternoon, and Dorothy had decided she needed confirmation that this was sanctioned before she could return to her afternoon. Each time the police had come, each time there had been no crime, each time Dorothy had thanked the officers and gone back inside feeling that she had done something useful. She had watched the moving trucks at 317 with an interest she told herself was neighborly and a suspicion she did not examine too carefully, and she had made a point of not going over to introduce herself. Which she understood somewhere beneath the layers of justification she'd built up over decades, was a choice she was making, not an oversight. Now, on this Saturday morning, she was standing at her window, and there was a man on the porch of 317, and everything Dorothy Pell had trained herself to see and not see came into play in the span of about 4 seconds. He was a large black man. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. He was standing on the porch of a house in Whitmore Heights. She did not think new neighbor. She did not think someone who just bought this house and is standing on his own property, drinking his own coffee on his own Saturday morning. She thought wrong, and she reached for her phone, and she did not call 911. She called the direct line because she knew that Officer Trent Voss picked up the Saturday morning shift most weekends, and Voss had never once asked her too many questions before responding. Voss answered on the second ring, and she told him what she saw, and she used the word suspicious 4 times in 40 seconds. And when she was done and had set the phone down on the windowsill, she looked back through the glass, and she saw Mara Osei out there on the sidewalk with that beagle. And for one moment, their eyes nearly met through the distance of the street, and Dorothy pulled the blind closed another inch. The man leaning against the railing of the porch at 317 Caldwell Street had not heard the phone call, and he was not thinking about anything more complicated than the way the wood grain of the railing was starting to show its age in a few places, a little weathering along the top edge where the finish had worn thin. And he was making a quiet mental note that he would need to sand it down and reseal it before the first hard frost came, because that was the kind of thing you thought about when you had finally, after 14 years of bureau apartments and extended stay hotels and one long stretch in a safe house in a city he was not allowed to name, bought a house that was actually and permanently yours. His name was Darius Cole, and on this particular morning he was not thinking about that either. He was holding a ceramic mug of black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and the steam was rising off it in a thin, slow curl that drifted sideways in the light autumn air, and the smell of it mingled with the smell of fallen oak leaves and the distant sharp edge of someone burning brush somewhere down the hill. And he breathed it in deliberately, the way a person breathes when they are trying to let something go. He was 49 years old and broad across the shoulders in a way that had less to do with vanity than with decades of a body that had been asked to perform under pressure and had always complied, and his hair was cut close to his scalp and threaded through with gray at the temples, and his eyes were the kind of dark brown that caught light in them without giving much back the eyes of someone who had spent a great deal of his professional life watching rooms and the people in them without being watched in return. But this morning on this porch, he was not watching anything in particular. He took a slow sip of his coffee and looked out at the quiet street and thought about the boxes still stacked in the living room and which ones held the books, and whether the kitchen window faced east enough to get morning light, and whether his daughter Zora, who was finishing her junior year and would be home for Thanksgiving in 3 weeks, would like the room he'd set aside for her at the back of the house where it was quieter. He heard the tires before he saw the car. The sound was specific and familiar in the way that certain sounds are to people who have spent years listening for them, not the soft rolling sound of a neighborhood car moving at residential speed, but the slower, deliberate crunch of a vehicle that was looking at something as it moved. And when the black and white cruiser came around the corner and began its approach down Caldwell Street, Darius felt his body register it before his mind named what it was. A particular shift in his posture, a stillness that was not relaxation, but its opposite. He did not step back. He did not go inside. He set one hand on the railing and watched the cruiser slow to a stop directly in front of his driveway, the front tires bumping against the curb with more force than a residential stop required, and he took another sip of his coffee and he waited. Both doors of the cruiser opened at almost exactly the same time, which told Darius something about what had already been decided before they pulled up. From the passenger side came a younger officer, probably not more than 8 or 9 months out of the academy by the look of him. black with a lean build and a careful way of moving that suggested he was still in the phase of his career where he was trying very hard to do everything correctly, and whose name tag read B. Okafor in raised silver letters, and who immediately began adjusting his duty belt with both hands in a habitual, slightly anxious gesture that he seemed unaware he was making. From the driver's side came Trent Voss. Voss was a man who had been on the Whitmore Township force for 14 years, and had the kind of career that looked fine on paper, if you didn't read the complaint files, which 3 different supervisors over those 14 years had made a quiet institutional habit of not reading too carefully. And the result was a man who had been allowed to become exactly what unchecked authority tends to produce. Over time, someone who had confused the power to compel with the right to dominate. He was stocky, with a platinum blonde buzz cut that had gone slightly coarser with age, and a face that flushed easily and was already flushing now, and he walked with his weight forward on the balls of his feet in a way that was less a gait than a declaration, the walk of a man who expected people to move out of his path before he reached them. He did not approach the walkway with any of the measured professional courtesy that a welfare check, which is technically what Dorothy's call had logged as, was supposed to require. He cut across the lawn in a direct line toward the porch steps, his right hand resting near the duty belt in that practiced, deliberate way that was designed to be noticed, and Darius noticed it, catalogued it, and did not react. At the edge of the property line, standing on the sidewalk with Cosmo sitting patiently at her feet, Mara Ose had gone very still. She had not planned to stop. She had been on her way back from the far end of Caldwell and had simply found herself standing there watching, because something about the way that cruiser had stopped told her she needed to pay attention, and she had spent enough years in this country and in this body to know when to trust that feeling. She did not reach for her phone, not yet, but she did not move either. Darius let the first silence land. Voss stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked up at him, and Darius looked back, and for a beat neither of them said anything, which was already a departure from the script Voss had written in his head during the 6-minute drive over, because in that script the man on the porch was supposed to look startled, was supposed to become immediately deferential, was supposed to provide the kind of visible discomfort that made the next part of the interaction feel justified. Darius provided none of those things. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Step down off this porch," Voss said. Not as a question, not with an introduction, not with a badge display or a stated reason, just the flat command of a man who assumed it would be sufficient. And for most of the people he'd said that kind of thing to over 14 years it had been. "Is there something I can help you with?" Officer Darius said, his voice pitched low and even. The kind of voice that doesn't need volume to fill a space. Voss's jaw tightened. "We got a call about a suspicious individual on this property. I'm going to need you to step down here and show me some ID." "On what legal basis?" Darius said. Not aggressively, just as a question, the way a person asks about a bus schedule. Voss took one step up onto the first stair. "Don't play games with me. You're standing on a property that was just vacated. The owners are gone. You don't look like you belong here." And there it was, laid bare, without even the pretense of being wrapped in anything else. Not legal language, not procedure, just the raw and unadorned assumption, the judgment that had been made before the cruiser door ever opened, the conclusion that had already been reached from across the street through a narrow gap in Venetian blinds. Darius set his coffee mug down on the small wicker table beside him. It was a quiet, unhurried movement. Behind Voss, Okafor was watching the mug go down, and something about the deliberateness of the gesture made the younger officer's hand pause in its reflexive adjustment of his duty belt. "I am the owner of this property," Darius said, still quiet. "I moved in 2 days ago." "Then you can prove it," Voss said, coming up another step. "ID. Now." "You don't have reasonable suspicion," Darius said. "You have a phone call. Those aren't the same thing." The flush on Voss's face deepened, spreading from his cheeks down toward his collar, and his hand moved from the duty belt to the retention strap of his holster. And the sound it made when he unclipped it, a small, dry snap in the still morning air, was the kind of sound that changes the temperature of a moment. And Okafor heard it. and Okafor's eyes went briefly to his partner's hand, and then away, and something shifted in the younger officer's face, something he did not yet have the language for, but that lived in him as a wrongness he couldn't locate precisely. At the edge of the property, Mara Ose heard the sound too. Her hand found the edge of her coat pocket. Darius did not look at the holster. He kept his eyes on Voss's face, and his own face gave nothing. Not fear, not defiance, not the performance of either, just a clear and level regard that had nothing pleading in it. And it was this more than any argument that got under Voss's skin in a way he couldn't manage, because there is a particular kind of composure that some people carry that reads to people like Voss not as innocence, but as an intolerable refusal to behave like someone who needs his permission to exist. Last chance, Voss said, his voice dropping into a register that had ended many conversations before this one. You put your hands out, or I put them out for you. Darius looked at him for one long moment, and then said quietly enough that it might not have carried to the street. You're making a mistake. Voss's hand closed around his wrist. Darius went completely still, not frozen still. There is a difference that is visible to anyone watching closely enough, and Mara Ose was watching closely enough. Frozen is what happens to a body that doesn't know what to do. Still is what happens to a body that knows exactly what to do and has chosen something that requires discipline to execute, and the discipline Darius was executing in this moment was the oldest and most costly discipline in his profession, the one that said, do not give them what they need to escalate this further, because further is where people get hurt. And getting hurt is not the point. I am not resisting, he said clearly and at a volume that carried, and Mara's hand came out of her coat pocket with her phone in it. This is an unlawful detainment. I am complying under duress. Voss pressed him forward against the railing hard enough to make the old wood creak and snapped the cuffs on with the deliberate extra notch of pressure that some officers used as a final small assertion of control, the metal biting into the skin of Darius's wrists in a way that would leave marks. Okafor patted down Darius's sweatpants and found the wallet in the back right pocket, a thick, dark brown leather billfold heavier than a standard wallet, and something about the weight of it made him pause for just a fraction of a second before Voss held out his hand. Toss it in the cruiser, Voss said, not looking at it, not opening it, not considering for even one moment that the contents of that wallet might require him to recalibrate everything he had done in the last 4 minutes. We'll sort out who he is at booking. Okafor set the wallet on the seat of the cruiser without opening it. Then, for a reason he would think about for weeks afterward and never be able to fully explain, he went back to the porch and picked up the ceramic mug of black coffee that was still sitting on the wicker table, still faintly warm, and carried it back to the cruiser with him, holding it with both hands, like something that needed to be kept safe. Nobody told him to do that. He just did it. Dorothy Pell watched all of this from behind her blind and felt for the first time since she'd made the call something that was not satisfaction. A cold and shapeless feeling that she told herself was nothing, was just the chill of the morning air coming through the old window frame. The man being walked down his own front steps toward the cruiser did not look at his house as he left it. He looked straight ahead at the street, at the trees, at the sky, with the calm, cataloging attention of someone who was already doing something else inside his head. Mara Ose lowered her phone. She had not taken a video. She had taken 4 photographs of the license plate, the badge numbers visible on both officers, the street address on the house, and the handcuffs, and she had sent them to a number in her contacts before Voss's door had finished closing. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the cruiser pull away, and she did not move until it had turned the corner and disappeared. And then she turned back toward the house at 317 and looked at the empty porch, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. Voss was in a good mood. He merged onto the main road with one hand on the wheel and the easy confidence of a man who had just handled something the way he believed things should be handled, and he said to the general space of the car's interior, rather than to Okafor specifically, "These people think knowing a little legal vocabulary makes them special. You see that standing there like he owns the place. He did own the place," Okafor did not say. In the back of the cruiser, separated by the thick plexiglass divider, Darius sat with his cuffed hands behind him, and his back straight and his eyes moving with a methodical, unhurried attention across everything visible from his window. The street signs, the precinct direction, the odometer, the badge numbers. He'd already read through the divider, the radio call sign on the unit identifier display. All of it going into a mental file he was building with the same practiced, unemotional efficiency he'd used to build 100 evidentiary records over 2 decades of federal work. He glanced once at the rearview mirror and found Okafor's eyes already there, already on him, and the younger officer looked away, but not quickly. There was a half-second of held contact before he looked away, and in that half-second, something passed between them that neither of them would have been able to describe, but that both of them felt. The ride to the precinct took 9 minutes. The back seat smelled like disinfectant and something older underneath it, and the plastic seat was hard, and the cuffs were tight enough that Darius's fingers were starting to feel the first dull throb of restricted circulation. And he noted all of this with the same flat internal register he used for everything. And he thought about the porch railing, about the sealant he still needed to buy, about what Zora would want for dinner when she came home in 3 weeks. He was not afraid. He was waiting. The Whitmore Township Police Department occupied a low, wide brick building that had been added onto twice in 30 years, and still somehow felt smaller than its square footage suggested, as if the accumulated weight of everything that had moved through its booking room had compressed the interior air into something denser than ordinary. On Saturday morning it smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner, and the particular papery staleness of a room full of filing that never quite got finished, and the overhead fluorescents hummed at a frequency that after enough years stopped being something you heard and became something you simply lived inside of. And Sergeant Ray Dunbar had been living inside it for 20 of those years, sitting behind the elevated booking desk, with his graying mustache and his reading glasses pushed down his nose, and a stack of arrest reports that had been waiting for him since Thursday. He looked up when Voss came through the back entrance with Darius in front of him, and something in his face shifted in a way that was small and involuntary, and would have been invisible to most people in the room. Dunbar had processed more than 4,000 arrests in his career, and he had a body of experience that had taught him what a person looked like when they'd been caught doing something, and what a person looked like when something had been done to them. And the man that Voss was steering through his booking room with the flat satisfaction of a successful hunt did not look like the first category. He looked like the second, and he looked like he knew it, and he was not afraid of it. And those 3 things together were enough to make Ray Dunbar push his reading glasses back up his nose and pay close attention. Voss leaned against the booking counter with his full weight and listed the charges in the tone of someone reading off a lunch order trespassing refusal to identify resisting arrest. He put up a fight, Dunbar said, looking past Voss at the man now seated on the metal bench bolted to the wall, back straight hands cuffed behind him, face giving absolutely nothing away. He was running his mouth, Voss said. Kept quoting law at me like a public defender. From the bench without inflection and without looking at Voss, Darius said, "Open the wallet." Just that. 3 words. Directed at nobody in particular, stated in the same tone a person might remind someone that the oven was still on. Voss turned and pointed at him with the authority of a man who had never had that gesture questioned. "You don't speak unless spoken to." Dunbar was already reaching for the wallet. He couldn't have said exactly why he was reaching for it before he was technically supposed to procedure, said to let Voss formally log the evidence first. But 20 years had given him a set of instincts that operated below the level of procedure, and those instincts were currently telling him something with an insistence that he'd learned not to ignore. He picked up the dark brown leather billfold, and he felt the weight of it. And the weight was wrong for a wallet, and he held that knowledge for 1 second before he flipped it open. It did not open to a driver's license. It opened to a leather interior that had been custom cut for something specific, and on the lower half of that interior sat a gold shield. Not silver, not a local department shield, but the solid, unmistakable federal gold of a bureau credential with an eagle at its crest and blue enamel letters around the seal that read in a font that carried all the institutional weight of 115 years of federal authority, Federal Bureau of Investigation. On the upper half, a laminated security card with a photograph, and next to the photograph in heavy black type. Darius Cole, Special Agent in Charge, Violent Crimes Division. Ray Dunbar's hand went still. Not shaking, still completely and absolutely still in the way that a body goes when the brain has just received information of sufficient magnitude that it stops allocating resources to anything except processing, and the wallet sat in his motionless hand and made the faintest sound against the booking counter, and Dunbar's eyes moved from the shield to the card to the photograph, and then very slowly up across the room to the man on the metal bench in faded gray sweatpants, with handcuff welts already forming on his wrists. Darius looked back at him. He gave one single nod. Just one. The color left Dunbar's face in a way that was visible even under the fluorescent light, a kind of rapid downward drain that left him looking older than he had 60 seconds ago, and he set the wallet very carefully on the counter, the way a person sets down something they suddenly understand they should not have been holding. "Voss," he said. His voice came out at half its normal volume, and Voss, who was pouring himself a coffee from the station pot with the contentment of a man who'd had a productive morning, did not look up immediately. Voss Dunbar said again, and this time something in the word, a texture, a flatness, a complete absence of the usual collegial ease made Voss turn around. Dunbar did not speak. He picked up the wallet and turned it around on the counter and slid it across until it was facing Voss, the shield, and the credential card fully visible. Voss walked back to the counter and looked down. The fluorescent light was very steady and very even, and there was nothing wrong with Trent Voss's eyesight. And so the process of reading what was in front of him took a full and terrible 3 seconds, during which his face moved through something that was not quite any single expression, but a rapid, uncontrolled sequence of them. Confusion giving way to recognition. Recognition giving way to the specific horror of a man who has just seen the ground disappear from beneath his feet and has not yet started falling. His knees bent just slightly, just enough to make him catch himself against the edge of the counter, and the coffee in his hand tilted, and a small dark splash hit the linoleum, and the sound it made was the loudest thing in the room. From the doorway of the booking area, Officer Ben Okafor stood holding the ceramic mug he'd carried in from the porch at 317 Caldwell, and he watched Trent Voss's face collapse, and he understood everything. Darius stood up from the metal bench. He did not ask for help, did not brace against the wall, just rose in one clean, unhurried motion as if the handcuffs were an inconvenience. He was choosing to work around rather than a constraint imposed on him. And the physical reality of him standing up in that booking room was something the room itself seemed to reorganize around the fluorescent light falling differently, the space between the furniture suddenly insufficient. "Sergeant," he said, and Dunbar was already moving around the desk with the key already saying, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." Agent Cole, in the fractured rhythm of a man trying to restore order to something he can feel slipping in multiple directions at once. The cuffs came off. Darius did not look at his wrists. He put the wallet in his pocket and turned to face Voss, and the distance between them was about 8 feet, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the room held that stillness the way a room holds its breath before something loud happens, except nothing loud happened, because Darius did not raise his voice. He lowered it. Title 18, United States Code Section 242. He said each word laid down with the flat precision of a man who had testified in federal courts 47 times and understood exactly how language becomes record. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Aggravated assault. Unlawful detention. Illegal transportation of a federal officer. He paused. Those are the charges. You can look up the sentencing ranges. Voss opened his mouth. "Agent, listen, the call came in. I know about the call," Darius said, and the way he said it closed the door on that particular room of argument permanently, without force, without volume, just a quiet and total certainty that there was nothing in that direction worth following. The door to the administrative hallway opened, and Captain Linda Farrow walked in, drawn by something she couldn't name, not a sound exactly, more an absence of the ambient noise a booking room normally produced on a Saturday morning, and she took in the scene in about 4 seconds. Dunbar behind the desk, looking like he was calculating how much of his retirement was still intact. Voss backed against the far wall with the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition of his own life. And a man in sweatpants, standing in the center of the room, radiating the kind of authority that had nothing to do with what he was wearing. "What is happening in here?" she said. Dunbar pointed at Darius. "That," he said carefully, "is Special Agent in Charge Darius Cole. FBI. Violent crimes." Farrow's eyes moved to the handcuff marks on Darius's wrists, and she went very still, and the calculation she was running behind her eyes, the institutional one, the reflexive one, the one about managing damage and protecting the department, was visible to everyone in the room, and Darius let her run it, let her reach the end of it. And then he placed his phone on the booking counter screen up and said, "I need all footage secured, both body cameras, the dash cam on Unit 4, and the dispatch audio from this morning. If those files move anywhere before my people get here, I'll need a federal warrant for this building, and the next call I make will be to the U.S. Attorney's Office." He looked at Farrow not unkindly, but without accommodation. "Which way are we doing this, Captain?" Farrow looked at Voss one final time, and whatever she saw there, the guilt that had given up trying to hide itself, the career that had already in the space of a single morning moved entirely into the past tense, made the decision for her. "Dunbar," she said. "Secure the footage, all of it, directly to me." The offer came 2 minutes later, delivered in the low, careful voice that administrators use when they are trying to make something that is not a favor sound like one. Agent Cole Farrow said, closing the door to the small side office she'd steered him toward, while Dunbar worked the computer terminal. "I want you to know that what happened this morning is not representative of this department. Officer Voss will face a full internal review, and I can assure you that internal review," Darius said, not as a question. Farrow paused. "The footage goes to my office," Darius said. "My office conducts the review. This becomes a federal civil rights matter this morning, or it becomes something worse next month when it surfaces through a different channel. Those are the options." He looked at her steadily. "You've been running this department for 15 years. I'm going to guess you've spent most of that time trying to do the right thing in a building where the right thing isn't always the path of least resistance." Farrow said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "So make it easier for yourself," Darius said. "Hand this over cleanly, and what I'll remember about you is that you didn't try to bury it." Farrow stood at that fork for about 10 seconds, which is a long time to stand at a fork when the consequences are running in both directions simultaneously, and then she walked back out to the booking area and told Dunbar to give the footage encryption key directly to the federal agents when they arrived. In the corner of the room, Okafor had set the ceramic coffee mug from 317 Caldwell on the end of the booking counter next to Darius's phone, and he had not moved from his position near the door, and when Farrow walked back in, she looked at him and said, "You kept your camera on." Okafor met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once, and whatever that nod meant, it was the beginning of something that would take Okafor a long time to understand. 3 black SUVs entered the precinct parking lot without sirens, without lights, without anything that announced them, except the sound of 3 engines arriving at the same time, and the way they arranged themselves in the lot in a pattern that was not random boxing in the local cruisers, with the unhurried precision of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. 5 agents in dark tactical clothing came through the front doors without pausing at the front desk, and the officer on reception duty opened his mouth and then closed it again, because there was something in the way these people moved that made the idea of stopping them feel like standing in a river and asking it to go around you. Leading them was Supervisory Special Agent Nia Brennan. a black woman in her late 40s with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of face that had long ago stopped performing anything for anyone, a face that simply registered and processed and responded with the economy of someone who did not have resources to waste on expression. She crossed the booking room, stopped in front of Darius, and looked at his wrists, where the marks from the cuffs had deepened into a bruised red line on each. She did not say anything about it. She didn't need to. The look lasted about 2 seconds, and was the most complete indictment of everything that had happened in the last hour. "Trent Voss," she said to Farrow. "Where is he?" "Hallway outside. Booking," Farrow said. Brennan nodded and turned to the 2 agents nearest her. "Full evidence custody, both body cameras dash, Unit 4 dispatch logs from 0600 forward." She looked at Dunbar. "Your logs too, Sergeant. Everything you received this morning." Dunbar said, "Yes, ma'am," with the promptness of a man grateful to have a clear instruction to follow. Brennan turned to Okafor, who had not moved. She looked at him for a moment, taking in the camera still clipped to his uniform, the set of his shoulders, the careful stillness of someone who has made a decision and is living in the consequences of it. "Your footage is intact," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Okafor said. "Voss know that." A pause. "He does now." Something that might have been in a different face. The beginning of a small nod of approval moved across Brennan's expression and was gone before it fully arrived. She turned back to the room and took it in Dunbar at the terminal Farrow, standing at the edge of her own authority, like someone who had just discovered its limits. The 2 federal agents already working at the filing cabinet, the ceramic mug sitting on the end of the booking counter, and she said to the room in general, "Secure and transfer." "Let's move." The cruiser that pulled up to 319 Caldwell Street at 11:47 that morning was not the one Dorothy Pell had been expecting. She had been in her kitchen repotting a fern near the window that faced the street, and she had the particular contentment of a person who believes they have done what needed doing, and has now returned to the normal and pleasant texture of their life. And when she heard the car doors close and looked up and saw 2 officers approaching her front path, she felt a warmth of vindication that she was already beginning to organize into a story she would tell at the next HOA gathering. She opened the door before they knocked. "Good morning," she said, her smile arranged and ready. "I'm so glad someone came by. I hope everything went smoothly. He really was behaving so suspiciously, I just felt I had to." Mrs. Pell said the older of the 2 officers, a heavy-set man with a weathered face and no answering smile. "Are you the party who made the call to Officer Voss at approximately 8:14 this morning regarding a man at 317 Caldwell Street?" "Yes," Dorothy said, the smile holding but requiring more effort now. "Yes, that's right. Is there a problem? Is he in custody?" "The man you called about is the legal owner of 317 Caldwell," the officer said, his voice carrying the specific flatness of someone delivering information they would rather not have to deliver, but are not going to soften. "He moved in 2 days ago. He bought the property in August." Dorothy's smile completed its collapse. "He is also the officer," continued a special agent in charge with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, "and as a direct result of your call this morning, one of our officers detained and handcuffed him on his own property without legal basis." I didn't know," Dorothy said, and the words came out smaller than she intended. "He was wearing sweatpants. He looked like he didn't belong there," the officer said without inflection. The silence that followed had a weight to it. From the sidewalk at the edge of Dorothy's property, Mara Ose stood with Cosmo sitting patiently at her feet, and she had not said a word, had not inserted herself into the conversation, had simply arrived and stood there in the way that a witness stands with the quiet and undemanding presence of someone who is there to see clearly and remember accurately. Dorothy looked at her across the yard, and Mara looked back, and between them passed something that did not need language. A recognition on Dorothy's side that her audience extended beyond the officers on her porch, that the street itself had been watching all morning, that it remembered everything she had done. The officer held out the citation. Dorothy's hand when she reached for it was shaking, and the soil from the fern she'd been repotting was still visible in dark crescents beneath her fingernails, and she signed her name where the officer indicated and the pen scratched against the paper. And it was very quiet on Caldwell Street, and the lily beds along the front walk were very white. The United States District Courthouse did not look like a place where lives ended, but it had hosted the ending of enough of them that the air inside its main corridor carried a particular quality of stillness that people who'd spent time in federal proceedings learned to read as a kind of warning, a reminder that what happened behind those mahogany doors did not negotiate and did not reverse. Trent Voss sat at the defense table in a gray suit that had been purchased for this occasion and had the rigid, uncomfortable look of clothing whose owner was not accustomed to wearing it, and his platinum blonde hair had been grown out slightly in the months since the arrest, as if he'd been trying unconsciously to look less like himself, and his posture was the posture of a man who had spent the better part of 5 months discovering that the institutional protection he'd counted on the Union, the department, the collegial silence that had absorbed 14 years of complaints without consequence had, at the moment it was most needed, simply declined to appear. The body camera footage from Officer Okafor's unit had been played twice during the proceedings, and both times the courtroom had watched in the specific silence of people absorbing something they cannot argue with Voss. On the porch steps, the unclipped holster strap, the deliberate over-tightening of the cuffs. Darius's clearly stated declaration that he was not resisting, and Voss's response to that declaration, and all of it recorded at a clarity and from an angle that left no room for reinterpretation. The federal prosecutor had been methodical and had needed to be nothing else, because the footage was the argument, and the only question the defense had ever actually had to answer was why, and the answer to why, when it was finally unavoidable, was the one that Voss's attorney had spent 5 months trying to keep out of the courtroom and had ultimately failed to keep out. Judge Patricia Odom was 61 years old and had presided over civil rights cases for 19 of her 23 years on the federal bench, and she looked at Trent Voss across the distance of the courtroom with the measured, unillusioned attention of someone who had seen this particular configuration before and found it neither surprising nor forgivable. "Mr. Voss," she said, "law enforcement is built on the idea that authority serves the community. All of it equally, without exception, and without prior categorization, based on what a person looks like standing on their own front porch on a Saturday morning." She paused, and the pause was not for effect, but because she was choosing her next words with the care they deserved. "You did not make a mistake. You made a pattern, and the record shows this was not the first time you made it. It is, however, the last time it will be made on a public salary." For the deprivation of rights under color of law, she sentenced Trent Voss to 36 months in a federal correctional facility. He was permanently barred from employment in any law enforcement, security, or public safety capacity. His municipal pension, to which he had contributed for 14 years, was forfeited in its entirety. When she read the pension forfeiture, Voss looked down at his right hand on the table, the hand that had worn the badge that had closed around Darius's wrist on the porch, that had tossed the wallet into the cruiser without looking at it, and he looked at it with an expression that was past grief, past anger, sitting somewhere in the flat and lightless country beyond both. In a conference room on the 4th floor of the same building, 3 other case files had been reopened that morning. 3 separate complainants from Voss's record over the previous decade. 3 interactions that had been absorbed by the department's internal process and never surfaced, never produced consequences, never made it as far as a courtroom. They were surfacing now. The conversation in Captain Farrow's office lasted 11 minutes, and Okafor had spent most of the preceding week knowing it was coming and deciding what he was going to do in it. Farrow was not a bad person, and she wasn't asking him to lie. Not exactly. She was asking him to write a report that emphasized certain things and did not dwell on others, to use the kind of language that creates a more ambulatory truth. One that can be moved in different directions depending on who needs it to go where. And she was asking in the careful, reasonable voice of someone who understood institutional survival and was offering to teach him how it worked. Okafor had sat in the chair across from her desk with his hands on his knees and his badge on his belt, and his body camera report already written and already printed and already sitting in a sealed envelope inside his jacket. And when she finished, he had reached into his jacket and placed the envelope on her desk and said, "I already wrote it." She looked at the envelope for a moment. "Okafor, it's complete," he said. "Everything I saw, everything I heard, the order to toss the wallet without opening it, the retention strap, all of it." Pharaoh looked at him for a long time, and he held the look without wavering, not combatively, just steadily, the way a person looks when they've made a decision they're going to have to live with and have decided they'd rather live with this one than the alternative. "You know what this does to your standing in the department," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She picked up the envelope. The months that followed were not easy, and Okafor had never told himself they would be. Some colleagues stopped talking to him in the ways they used to, and some of the silences in the break room were deliberate and had faces attached to them, and he was transferred to a different precinct on the east side of the township, which added 22 minutes to his commute and removed him from every partnership and routine he'd spent 8 months building. He went through it methodically, the way he went through everything. His reports filed on time, his procedures clean, his camera on at the start of every shift without exception, because that was the only thing he'd decided that he could control about what kind of officer he was going to be, and it turned out that controlling that one thing made a great deal of the other things clearer. On his last day at the old precinct, he was clearing out his locker when he found the academy graduation photo he'd taped to the inside of the door 8 months ago himself, in the dress uniform. 24 years old, holding the diploma, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was mostly hope and partly terror. And he looked at it for a moment, standing there in the empty locker room, and he put it in his jacket pocket, not in the trash, and he closed the locker and walked out. 3 weeks later, standing outside his new precinct after his first full shift, he found Mara Ose at the bus stop on the corner, Cosmo sitting at her feet, and she looked at him with the recognition of someone who has filed a face carefully in a permanent place. "I remember you," she said. "From Caldwell Street." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You kept your camera on," she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Yes, ma'am." She nodded in the way that someone nods when a thing that was uncertain has just been confirmed, and she picked up Cosmo's leash and turned toward the bus, and Okafor stood on the corner in the late afternoon light and felt for the first time since that Saturday morning that the weight of the choice he'd made had become something he could carry without needing to set it down. The story ran in the local paper on a Tuesday, buried at first in the police blotter section, and then migrated to the front page of the regional edition 2 days later when a wire service picked it up under a headline that Dorothy would see only once before she stopped looking. Local woman's 911 call leads to unlawful arrest of black FBI agent on his own property. Her name was in the 3rd paragraph. The HOA called an emergency meeting that she was not invited to attend, but whose outcome was communicated to her by letter, delivered by hand by the association secretary. A woman Dorothy had shared afternoon tea with for 11 years, who rang the bell and handed her the envelope, and said with an expression that was not unkind, but was also not warm, "I'm sorry, Dorothy," and turned and went back down the porch steps before Dorothy could respond. The letter informed her in 3 brief paragraphs that her membership on the board had been suspended, pending review of conduct inconsistent with the association's stated values, and that all standing committee appointments had been vacated effective immediately. Dorothy read it twice and then set it on the kitchen table next to the fern she'd finished repotting, the one she'd been working on when the officers came to her door, and she went to the window and looked out at Caldwell Street, the way she had looked out at it 10,000 times in 22 years, and it looked exactly the same as it always had. And that was somehow the thing that undid her. The fact that the street itself was unchanged. That the oak trees were the same, and the sound of the irrigation timer was the same, and that the change was entirely located inside her window in the space between herself and the view she was looking at. Neighbors did not stop speaking to her. It was more specific than that they spoke to her when proximity required it in the necessary and minimal exchanges of people sharing a street. But the afternoon visits stopped and the waved greetings across driveways happened less, and there was a quality to the interactions that remained that Dorothy recognized after a while as the particular discomfort of people who had seen something in her that made them need to examine something in themselves, and who found that examination uncomfortable, and who resolved that discomfort by reducing the frequency of contact rather than completing the examination. She put the house on the market 6 weeks after the article ran on a Thursday morning in early December, and she did not tell anyone on Caldwell Street that she was going, and the for sale sign appeared in the yard without announcement, and by the time the first showing was scheduled, Dorothy had already packed the things she considered irreplaceable and arranged for the rest to be handled by an estate company. She did not look at the house across the street when she left. It was early spring when Darius came back to the porch. The oak trees on Caldwell Street were beginning to open again, the first tentative green appearing at the branch tips, and the morning air had that particular quality that appears for only a few weeks in the year. Cold enough still to make the coffee steam, but warm enough that staying outside with it felt like a choice you'd made for yourself rather than an endurance test. And Darius came through the front door of 317 in the same gray sweatpants and white t-shirt, carrying the same ceramic mug, and leaned against the railing that he had sanded and resealed in November, the wood beneath his hands smooth and new-smelling, and exactly as solid as a thing is when it's been tended to properly. The moving boxes were gone. There were books on the shelves inside visible through the large front window and a patterned rug in the hallway that Zora had picked out over Thanksgiving and argued for with a conviction that had reminded Darius of someone he couldn't immediately place, and then had, which had made him agree to it immediately. The kitchen window did face east. He had confirmed this on the first Sunday he was in the house standing at the counter with his coffee at 7 in the morning, watching the light come in, and he had thought, yes, this will do. This will do for a long time. Zora was home for spring break, occupying the back bedroom where it was quieter, and she came out through the screen door now carrying her own mug and her school reading, and she folded herself into the porch swing with the complete physical ease of someone who had decided this was her space. And for a while they were both just there in the morning quiet, the swing moving slightly, the oak trees shifting in the light. Mara Osei came around the corner of Caldwell with Cosmo pulling cheerfully at his leash, and she and Darius exchanged the particular nod of people who have shared something without being required to speak about it constantly. The nod of a shared history that has been filed and doesn't need to be reopened to remain present. And she kept walking, and Cosmo investigated something at the base of the oak tree, and the morning continued. A patrol unit moved slowly down Caldwell. New officer on the weekend shift, probably because Darius didn't recognize the face. And as the cruiser passed number 317, the officer glanced over and Darius met the look, and the officer raised one hand from the wheel. A brief, open, uncomplicated wave, the greeting of one person to another on an ordinary street on an ordinary morning. Darius nodded back. "Do you like it here?" Zora asked, turning a page. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The railing was warm already from the morning sun, the new sealant making the grain of the wood visible in a way it hadn't been when he first arrived. He looked down the length of Caldwell Street at the oak trees and the clean driveway edges and the for sale sign across the street that someone had taken down last week, which meant a new family was coming or would be, and they would bring their boxes and their Saturday mornings and their coffee and their version of ordinary, and ordinary, he had come to believe was not a small thing. "It has potential," he said. Across the street, the house at 319 Caldwell stood waiting for whoever came next, its Venetian blinds drawn all the way down for the first time in 22 years, the lily beds along the front walk still white and flowering, because the bulbs didn't know anything had changed, tended now by no one answering only to the season. Somewhere across town, in a precinct that was not the one he'd started in Ben Okafor, was finishing his morning paperwork with the same deliberate completeness he brought to it every day. Now, every box filled, every timestamp accurate, every account of every interaction written as if it would someday be read by someone who needed to know exactly what happened because he had learned on a Saturday morning in October that someone always did. Darius finished his coffee. The steam was gone. The morning had arrived fully filling the street with the unceremonious ordinary light of a day that didn't know it was supposed to mean anything. And that was the thing about meaning. He had always thought it didn't live in the loud moments, but in the quiet ones that came after, in the weight of a mug in your hand, and the solid feel of a railing you'd fixed yourself, and the sound of your daughter turning a page unhurried at home. If this story moved you, if you've ever been judged before, you were known or stood firm when standing firm cost something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about dignity, justice, and the people who refuse to disappear, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. The next story is already waiting.